So this is lesson 5, understanding RUSLE2 inputs, and we're going to focus on our crop management or C factor. Okay, so shown this in multiple lessons before. Our original RKLSCP equals A formula, RUSLE2's foundation. Okay, so we've got these factors. The management factor, okay, in a conceptual diagram of RUSLE2's profile calculation, it features here. This is where it actually shows up. It's not called the C factor. I'll say that multiple times in this lesson. RUSLE2 doesn't use the term C factor. It refers to a management or a management file. And actually, that's a nested mini model, you could say, where the user can customize how they want to model what the farmer's doing. We choose different dates and operations and vegetations and yields, right? That's the old, what we used to call the cover management factor. It's in RUSLE2. So what does this all mean? Well, we're going to dig into this cover management factor a bit, but I've already here indicated it's the farmer's management of the crop and the soil. And basically, the C factor, or the management in RUSLE2, tells RUSLE how well the farmer is keeping the soil covered on top, making it a sponge underneath. It is a very important factor. And I'm going to emphasize this. Let's go back to this. This sometimes is confusing to folks. The farmer can do 2 types of management, a cover management or management type activity, but also a support factor. And I want to emphasize the difference. A P or support factor, support practice, is a very specific type of practice that reduces runoff velocity primarily. It can also, involve draining the field, but this is going to be a very limited range of activities, right? While most of our farmers' management is going to fall under the C factor. And I'm going to use this diagram to emphasize this idea. There are contour buffer strips here. There is obviously contouring going on. It appears there's contouring. This is not in Virginia, by the way. But you can see it's pretty impressive, this contour farming system and these buffer strips, right? And especially over here, you can just picture the water running down and being intercepted and slowed. Oh, that sounds great. It looks impressive. But what I'm emphasizing, I've said this before, is the most important point I want you to remember here in these last 10 minutes of our class and this lesson. These support practices do not protect the soil, okay, here, where sheet and rill erosion starts. On these side slopes, when they're bare, or when there's any soil exposed, those raindrops are going to impact, they're going to detach. These support practices are there more or less to catch the runoff after it's already started. So to protect the soil in the bulk of the field, we need a C factor type of practice. Okay, so that's kind of the difference between C and P. The C factor is a measure of the impact of the farmer's management of crop, soil, and cover on the field susceptibility to erosion. It is really the trump card. Good management can eliminate erosion and improve the soil on any slope if we give it enough time, right? But poor management can produce erosion and destroy the soil on almost any slope in a relatively short time. So management is the biggest driver of soil loss risk. It is the heart of the RUSLE2 project, if you will. It's 100% under the farmer's control in that, even if the farmer doesn't want to consider it, I'm a vegetable farmer, I need to grow vegetables every year. There is at least one alternative. It may not be one that's economical for you or that you want to consider doing, but you could take that land out of vegetables and rotate it to sod. There is a way. You can't do no-till vegetables, but there is a way to find an alternative that meets T and even one that goes beyond T. So and like I said, this file right here in RUSLE2 world defines your crop management factor. It's the heart and the hardest part of the RUSLE2 calculation. What does this all mean, Chris? Put it in real words. These are the processes that impact the C factor and the sheet and rill erosion in the real world in RUSLE2, right? So this will give you less detachment of soil from raindrop impact and less transport, and therefore less sheet and rill erosion risk. These are the things that in the real world matter and make sheet erosion less and rill erosion less likely to happen. More canopy cover, living or dead, plants standing, living or dead to intercept raindrops. More ground cover, a huge factor to intercept raindrops where the cover is living or dead. More roots, living or dead roots binding up the soil, reducing its potential to be detached, making it more of a sponge so it can soak in more water. More perennials, okay? And you'll notice there's this asterisk. I'll show you what that means in a moment. More yield. Folks, more yield is better for erosion prevention. More canopy gets you more canopy, more cover when the stuff dies, more roots, okay? More external residue, right? RUSLE2 and in the real world, when you apply manures and other organic matter mulches, they will, maybe not in a dramatic way, but they will improve your erosion performance. Of course, less tillage and more time with no tillage. So if the soil consolidates over time, that's going to benefit you. And so the asterisk means more quantity and or duration, right? So the longer you have canopy, and the more canopy you have during that time, right, the better off you are. So these are all factors that matter in the real world. And in RUSLE2, RUSLE2 can model all this in the management file. And of course, there's other lessons, many lessons on how to convey this kind of information to RUSLE2. And you know, this is the opposite, right? So when we have less canopy, less ground cover, less roots, less perennials, less yield, more tillage, right? We're going to have more detachment risk and more erosion risk. And these are the factors that I should say, the processes that we can model in RUSLE2 and that impact our C factor and therefore our sheet and rill erosion. The beautiful thing is that the C factor practices that tend to reduce sheet and rill erosion risk also tend to build soil organic matter and soil health, right? And that's why if we have folks focused on improving their soil and its productivity, erosion can become a thing of the past. However, if you are pretending that you want to achieve, you know, improved soil health and build soil quality and have more earthworms, but you don't fully understand the crucial need to keep the soil well covered, intercept all those raindrops, and eliminate erosion, you're not going to get there. It's a potentially confusing term. Okay, I already mentioned this. The C factor is a key element inside the RUSLE model, but the term is not used. And I think I can jump through this. I already think I explained this. You don't see the C factor number, right? You just enter information about the farmer's operations and so forth. And behind the scenes right here, RUSLE2 translate that management file into numeric values and then plugs those values into the erosion model. So you don't see a C factor number like we used to when folks used, you know, the original USLE equation. It can also be a potentially confusing term today because we use C, you know, in two different ways in the Virginia soil conservation context, right? So I've been using it just now to refer to the USLE or RUSLE cover management factor for sheet and rill erosion prediction, but C, of course, can also mean carbon, soil organic matter, managing for soil health. We talk about soil C. If you're not sure which meaning is intended, just plug in the full term and see what makes sense. So in the previous lesson, I told you about this, the old NRCS soil health slogan, go beyond T, manage for C, right? Look to build soil health, don't just manage for tolerable losses. Let's eliminate erosion, let's go beyond. So what does C mean in that context? Well, if you plug in manage for cover management factor, go beyond T, manage for cover management factor, that doesn't make sense. But if you put in this, go beyond T, manage for soil organic matter, that makes sense. So it is a little confusing, but just remember, go beyond T, manage for C means we're managing for regeneration. And, you know, that takes us, you know, to back to this point, guys. We have a lot of interest in soil health and improving organic matter, even sequestering carbon to fight climate change. Y'all, it starts with keeping the soil covered. And that's part of what RUSLE2 will help us do, account for the fact that on some slopes, to improve soil health, we have to keep the soil very well covered. And so surface residue cover is one of our most important, you know, elements to be considered in RUSLE2 and in the real world. So this is a graph that from USLE era, like decades old guidance documents. And this is a good foundational idea. On this graph, we have surface residue cover increasing, right? And we have erosion reduction increasing in this direction, right? So the idea here is that if we start out, let's say with a bare field, if we can increase our surface residue from 0% cover to 30% cover, right? So we get 30% cover, we get a pretty big reduction in erosion. If we can jump up to 60%, which is another target that's often cited, we get up to here about 85% reduction. And if we can get to 100% cover, right, we can get to 90% erosion reduction. So this is a model. It's a very simple model. You could take this to the field and you can measure residue, and you could say, well, because you have 80% residue, you're going to have this much reduction. RUSLE2 puts a huge emphasis on this, but it's not the only thing RUSLE2 considers. But in the real world, we know that this is continuous no-till in the Shenandoah Valley, right? The farmer said he was doing continuous no-till. Well, if there's not a lot of residue, continuous no-till is not that effective. So you see a pedestal here. It's actually a soybean root. So we've lost all this soil from this area, at least in this spot. A lot of sheet erosion. This soybean root is sitting up on this pedestal. Pretty dramatic looking. And measuring residue, coming out here and actually measuring the residue is a useful erosion risk assessment technique. You do not need to use RUSLE2. We can go to the field and teach you a little bit more about how to measure it, but getting a sense of how much residue is out there at different points in the rotation, you can compare that to what RUSLE2 thinks is happening. Okay, and that's a more advanced topic, but in reality, there's more to it than just residue, right? In reality and in RUSLE2, the impact of management, how good a sponge you build, is also important. So I'll give you an example. Look at these two soils, same soil type. They're from across the road from each other. If you tilled this one up for the first time, which is what I did when I pulled it out of the ground, put it in this tray. If you tilled this up and you tilled this up and they have the same amount of residue, even if it's tilled and bare, same residue cover, these two soils are not going to erode at the same rate, at least for a while, until this soil starts to degrade more. But it's called a meadow effect, right? If you take soil out of sod, or a field out of sod, and you open it up, it is not going to erode as fast. And RUSLE2 has some science in it that attempts to address that. So RUSLE2 considers surface residue very strongly, but it also tries to account for what's happening in terms of the soil aggregation, soil consolidation, and some of those things. The final point here, as I end this lesson, is just remember this idea that our C factor is very, very important. Our representation of the farmer's management, very, very important for in the real world and in RUSLE2 for protecting the soil, preventing detachment, keeping the soil in place. P factor, contour farming, buffer strips like these, support practices, which we can model in RUSLE2, they are not the starting point. So here's our interactive review question to end this lesson. It actually covers a point that I just made here before we ended. We have identical net levels of crop residue in two systems. So same levels of residue. Is there an advantage to well-managed continuous no-till versus something where there's occasional full-width tillage? Goes back to that question, is consolidation of the soil over time, just leaving it undisturbed, assuming we have a well-managed system, does that have a benefit? Or is RUSLE2 and in the real world, are we only interested in residue cover? Even if residue is the same in two systems, if we have a well-managed, very low disturbance system versus one that has periodic disturbance, we should get less soil detachment due to more consolidation. That's something that RUSLE2 tries to account for. And we should get less soil transport due to better infiltration, right, in the real world. And RUSLE2 at least is supposed to be able to account for these things. It's not just a simple model that looks at residue amounts. So the right answer is both of the above. And this is incorrect. Residue is crucial, but we think that making soil sponge underneath has an additional advantage.